All right, we'll begin. We're having a little bit of difficulty with some of the technology, so we're going to hold off the music today. We'll return to that next week, and our intention is to try to put some of the make some of the podcasts available after at least the ones up through now next week. And I realize some people are away for Passover, and I've gotten a request from some of those students in particular, but I recognize there are other people who the university is interested in seeing whether students find them useful. Our batteries ran out last time, so we only have half of that lecture. I don't quite know whether the university expects me to sit in a dark classroom someplace and tape the rest of it at some point, or whether we'll just proceed. That I don't know. We have a fairly full agenda today. I want to talk about the history of mass transit in New York City. This is tape fragment, I'm not sure whether, I guess it's 5 or 4, I think 4, 5, fragment 5. Okay, thank you. They're all up now on the blackboard through number 6, okay, for you to look at. And again, they're all East Village. I don't know what kind of hint to give you for this one other than to probably tell you I think it's on 4th Avenue. That's about as good as I can do. That should help. Okay. I also will remind you that while we take attendance in the discussion sections because obviously you're supposed to be there to discuss, and it's hard to do that when you're absent. And I gather the attendance there has been fine. I'm not usually a stickler about this, but the university has asked us to do periodic spot checks as a way of encouraging participation and attendance. So it's likely there'll be another kind of sign-in sheet in the next week or two. So just be forewarned, at least. Okay. New York City was a walking city until the 1820s. We're going to cover a long period today. We'll move quickly because most people are interested in the subways, the history of the subways, rather than in the earlier forms, but we'll talk about all of those as well. A walking city meant generally a radius of about 2 miles. That's to say, the presumption was that you wanted to be within 30 minutes of your workplace, the amount of time that you would spend. And most people traversed on foot because what transit there was always exacted a fee. And we've talked about wages, and you know for most of the population, wages were low, and therefore transit was a luxury. There were some commercial carts, some coaches, carriages, and they were primarily of the well-to-do, the wealthy people, the rich. You know, the carriage houses, for instance, behind Washington Square Park, those served the merchants, for instance, who lived in the housing on Washington Square North. We've looked at some of the carriage houses you would have seen when we were walking through Chelsea or some of the other areas. You remember there were some carriage houses, those of you who joined me when we walked through Brooklyn Heights. And you could see from the number of those houses, carriage houses, that the number of carriages was limited really to serve a very small part of the population, but they were there. By and large, the city depended on pedestrian traffic. And for most people, that meant a lot of mud. We've talked about that before. But by the early 19th century, increasingly cobblestone is the means of pavement. And you can still see some of that even around this particular area in Washington Square Park. And that dates back really 150 years. The population takes off, as we've documented, starting in the 20s and 30s with industry and commerce. And there become increasing needs to find a way of getting people to work and from further distances. The well-to-do are moving further out of the city into these new suburbs, whether it was Washington Square or Chelsea, or some people to Brooklyn Heights. And transport there, as you know, was the Fulton Ferry. That made it possible to Brooklyn Heights. For the other areas, it meant they still were walking, and that meant if they weren't walking and using carriages, the carriageways had to improve as much as they could to still make it possible for people to get back and forth to work in a fairly expeditious way. Mass transit begins in the 20s and through the 60s, in the pre-war period, with what was known as an omnibus. An omnibus. Initially, just think stagecoach or an enlarged hackney coach. They were standardized in the 1830s as a rectangular box. There you are, pulled by a horse. There's a stagecoach from 1831 in New York City. They usually had two long seats, bench seats on either side, for anywhere from 12 to 20 passengers. And you can imagine that 20 would get to be pretty cramped, 12 would be easier. By 1837, there were 108 of these stagecoaches carrying people in New York City. So again, you can understand that not everyone's using them. They're run largely by small private businessmen. It's a form of enterprise. There is no such thing as what we would now call the MTA, municipal transit or metropolitan transit. It is not a public service, it is a private service. There was a little bit of regulation in their history, if you remember the history of the cartmen. Okay, the cartmen had been carrying people earlier. This, on the whole, this is no longer terribly regulated, this service, the stagecoach service. They're run for profit, not as a public service. So the routes are along the heaviest traveled roads where where at least they could expect not to be interfered with pedestrian traffic, but more importantly, where they could expect to find ridership. And they tended to end at what would be destination markets, so markets, or a suburb, places where people lived. They, in turn, in other words, their routes were shaped by patterns of settlement, but they had also the impact of, in turn, shaping settlement. Because once they're in place, it encouraged more and more people then to want to settle at the destinations or along the routes. So they, on the one hand, are shaped by settlement, but on the other hand, they also then shape further settlement afterwards. People want to live along the routes of these routes. The rides were 5 to 10 cents, which, again, if you remember that people could be being paid as little as 50 to 75 cents for a day's work, meant that the working class on the whole was not going to be using this. So we've talked about last time working class formation, earlier in this semester, working class formation during this period. We talked last time about the emergence of what we might call a middle class, but that's an amorphous term because today, is there anybody here who doesn't think they're middle class? Okay. On the whole, it's become a kind of basket term which everyone thinks they belong to. So it's lost a lot of its kind of contemporary meaning around class terms. So the term that you'll recall that the historians were using was to talk about a merchant or a bourgeoisie that's emerging in New York City in the 19th century as a very particular kind of social formation rather than just an idea that people have about their income or their status level. Those are the people who could afford this, and on the whole were doing so. Artisans, not just skilled workers, but artisans who were developing a craft, and some of those artisans would then set up their own business. So it's artisans who are also small property owners and businessmen, small merchants. And of course, the new kind of corporate class, lawyers and people who would be going into the banking business and the insurance industries, etc. The conditions, as you can expect in something like this, were not luxurious. They're pretty cramped. There was no ventilation or padding. Straw was put on the floor. And there was no such thing as scheduling, or very little scheduling. So you just hoped that they came along on their route. And the riders often reported that the drivers were terrible, or often quite rude. There was no such thing, in other words, that had emerged yet as something that we might call service. Okay? We would call service. But with all of that, they were a success. Everybody complained about them, and increasingly people were hooked on it. It beat walking, it beat the mud, and it got you there faster. And as a consequence, urban mass transit was effectively born in the 1830s around this institution. And increasingly, people, who are seeking a profit, want to find a way to make this service more attractive to a broader social class of people. That's to say, they're looking for a market for consumers. And the market increasingly will not expand upwards in the social ranks, but downward in the social ranks. And the technology that will facilitate that, of course, is the railroad. And that is beginning at almost the same time. Okay? But unlike this, which can go on any street because it's just pulled by a horse, railroads on the whole went on rails, and they were therefore limited to wherever the rails were laid on the street laid, so that they were much more limited forms of service, but they held the promise of going faster and of taking more people. As early as 1831, a banker by the name of John Mason and a couple of the large landowners interested in real estate development won a charter for the Common Council for the first railroad. And there's a logic, if you think about that, to why those would be the people doing it. First of all, this was not like just opening up a sweatshop where all you needed was a needle and thread. You needed enough money, you needed capital to buy this thing called an engine. Okay? And they cost a lot of money. So to have a banker involved was not a surprise. And to have real estate developers was not a surprise, because these were the people who were looking for a way of getting people to their houses, to their homes. It wouldn't surprise you, for instance, in the post-war era, to know that the real estate industry was among the strongest backers of the development of an interstate highway system, because that was another way, again, of getting people into these suburban areas where they wanted to build housing. So they saw it as an enormous subsidy for their particular kind of interest. Well, the history of that begins in the 1830s with these real estate developers. They build the first, which is called the New York and Harlem Railroad, where they get a charter to build it. It takes most of the decade to actually finish it. They win lots of financial support from investors who quickly oversubscribe the venture. They get $350,000 to build this. That was a lot of money in New York then. Now it'll buy you a one-room studio, maybe. So we're talking about 1830s money, however, in which case we're really talking about money worth many millions of dollars. Okay, many millions of dollars. What did it amount to? It meant putting flanged wheels on double tracks, okay, and laying them in the road. And it was to start again at a particular kind of location, City Hall in this case. And it was eventually to get to Harlem. And it was to do so initially along 4th Avenue. That's really where we now would call the Bowery and 4th Avenue, as you know, up near, it's basically on the east side of what would become Central Park. In 1832, the service begins, and the first, as it were, train is called the John Mason, after this man who ran it. But while they're on carts that are again pulled by horses. So the early power for these kinds of things was again horses. Let's see what we have. Horse cart in New York. You can see the rails, the train on the rails, so it's limited in its track, but there's the power. Horsey. Okay? So Dobbin is providing the power for this initial train. So what they've elaborated now is a technology that allows them to not get stuck in the mud, to move more quickly, but they're still limited to having what we now call, when we buy our cars, horsepower. Okay. It went from the Bowery along from Prince Street all the way to 14th Street, and eventually initially went to its first depot, which was 27th Street. It carried 30 passengers, so it's doubled the size, tripled the size of the earlier horse carts, and it was able to reach a very high speed, 7 to 12 miles an hour. So some of you could outrun it. But you didn't have Nikes, and you had a lot of mud to work your way through. By 1833, it progressed further north, but it encountered problems that early transportation networks would face. It was called a hill. And the horse would have to carry it over the hill, or they'd have to cut through the hill. This was called Murray Hill. And it required a tunnel, which is in fact still in use. And they were able to proceed. And ultimately, they'd have to build other tunnels, one 92nd to 94th Street. They'd have to ford a creek. And in 1837, they reached Harlem. So So by 1837, we have a means of mass transit, if you'd like, that goes from the lower part of Manhattan into all the way up as far north as Harlem. Though I'm going to be talking about the history of Harlem next time, you'll note that at this period, this is a really small outlander village. Okay? So it's still a very small village. It is not intricately connected, but this tie will make a difference. The first run ended in an accident. The driver, there were two cars they put together, and the driver of the second car forgot to put a brake down and plows into the first car. So they early would have accidents. There was an emerging technology. People put their lives in their hands going on these things. But by 1838, it was a regular service to Harlem for 25 cents. Again, that suggests to you only wealthy people could really afford this service. Or else you took it as an extraordinary luxury in just a moment of crisis. So it was pretty much 50% of a day's pay for a day laborer. So unless you really were pretty affluent, this was not a service that you took your family on or anyone else. Okay? The city began to pass ordinances, however, about this technology, prohibiting steam engines from south of 27th Street. So that's where they use horse carts. So they developed the steam to run these engines, but south of 27th Street, where everybody's living, they don't want the steam breathing into the air and polluting in the noise. So they're horse carts, and then they convert to steam. It was not unlike, and I think it's actually still in place, if you go on the New Haven Railroad and we're going north, part of it is electrified and part of it wasn't. So there are different kinds of systems that continue to operate as these technologies lag. The horse carts challenge the omnibus for dominance of the city streets. They're more stable, they're easier to maneuver, and obviously they could negotiate. The cobbled streets were not easy to negotiate. They're pretty uneven. Those of you who wear heels, for instance, could know what it would be like to walk. I don't do this as regular practice. I presume some of you do. And you would know, I presume, that that's not so easy to do. But by the 30s, the omnibus still rules. In the 1840s, the 50s, the horse car lines begin to take over. So it's a short period from this earlier stagecoach that we have, and by the 40s and the 50s, this becomes increasingly predominant. The New York and Harlem line runs every 10 minutes, and in 1840, it even bridges the Harlem River, and it reaches the Bronx. And by the next decade, it would even go as far as the border of Westchester County. So while none of that was incorporated into New York, in its own way, New York City as a place, if we think of it as not defined, or cities as defined entirely by political boundaries, if we think of it as much defined by the kind of networks that hold people together in which they live and operate, in fact, it had already extended into the areas that are now the political boundaries of New York. Okay. And a Harlem River line is developed, a second line along 10th and 11th Avenue in 1847. You don't need to know all of these things, but listen just quickly and you'll hear that in the 50s, lines are developed up every most major avenues. 1851, there's a 6th Avenue line that goes up as far as 59th Street. Why does it stop in 59th Street? Anyone? There's a park. Okay, there's a park. Otherwise, they have to go through the park. 6th Avenue, you recall, runs in dead ends in the park. Okay, 1852, the 8th Avenue line.
I'm sorry, did you say it was developed along most major avenues?
Most major avenues.
Okay, so there's how many exactly on Manhattan?
You're going to hear in a minute. Hang along. Not every avenue. So there's none on 7th Avenue. There's one on 6th Avenue. We'd already had one on 4th Avenue before. We have one on 8th Avenue. And that one is not stopped by the park, so it goes all the way up Central Park West. There's one on 2nd Avenue that goes up only as far as 42nd Street. And in 1858, they developed two additional lines, a 3rd Avenue and a 9th Avenue line. So we basically have one on 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, 4th Avenue, 6th Avenue, 8th Avenue, 9th Avenue, and 10th Avenue. So that's a lot of the city, at least the long avenues. They don't all go all the way to the north, because settlement hasn't proceeded that far. All right? They're virtually all going up, however, to Midtown, and some are going all the way up. But as you can hear, they're developing now the possibility for what we will later call the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side to develop along the lines of these trains. They are, as I've suggested before, all, however, private ownership. Okay? And they required, therefore, capital to build them. So they mostly are organized along corporate ownership of 8 to 15 men, usually quite wealthy men, who own the stock in these companies and are able, because of the position that they hold usually in society already. They're well-heeled people. They're people who work in banking. They work in insurance. They're lawyers. They're able to go to banks and get the money. So it's not always their own money. They're people who are deemed to be credit-worthy. Okay? The irony, as we know, is that the rich generally get richer because they have the capacity, usually because of their wealth, to claim at least good credit. And as a consequence, they're the ones who are given this money and are able to borrow this money. So they're the ones on the whole that own most of these new private enterprises, not surprisingly. There's a great deal of competition for the best profits, and each line effectively operates as a monopoly on each of these avenues. And that's how it's done. Okay? So they're given effectively monopolies by the city for each of these lines. So you don't end up having two competing lines on 3rd Avenue or two competing lines on 8th Avenue. Each company gains a monopoly for the service on each of these lines. There are problems, nonetheless, that get in the way of their immediate success. Some of them you might be able to guess. You've got all these horses pulling these cars. The horses are very good at pulling cars, but they leave behind at least a lot of manure. And there were problems about what to do with it. The streets for the pedestrians were not always made easier by the horse cars. The horses had to pull very heavy weight, and that weight becomes even more onerous as the number of passengers increase. So the technology becomes more and more difficult to sustain with the use of horses. It creates construction chaos on the cities because streets after streets are closed down in order to lay the rails. And the cars, of course, interfere with other kinds of traffic, pedestrian traffic, cart traffic. People who want, in fact, be able to get supplies and material into their stores are complaining that these trains are, in fact, impeding their ability to do business. They're bringing passengers, they're bringing customers, and they're happy in that regard, but they're also arguing that at the same time, they get in the way of their ability to stock their warehouses, stock their shops. So the service is often uneven, and it creates unintended urban development. In other words, there's no planned development around these kind of areas. It's created in part by the ability of lines to go in one place or another and people to feel that they can get the cars to stop near where they're going to build their housing and the developments. Some areas are served, some areas are not served, and so people don't live in those areas. They live where the trains run. Okay? So, for instance, they don't run on the whole north of Harlem, except where they're going, where the one line is going all the way up to Westchester, but not on the west side. So some areas are developed by this and some are not. There's also increasing problems around crowding. The crowding, by the way, is of course encouraged if you're an owner, because crowding was the basis of what's called business, fares. It was revenue. And increasingly, crowding was encouraged by most of these owners as a way of what we would simply call increasing production. Okay? So it was something that the owners wanted to encourage. At the same time, they wanted to tell people that, look, we're going to try to make it as comfortable as we can. So they had often countervailing impulses that were generating how these things were, how these new services were going to be run. On the one hand, an owner wanted people to use them and wanted people to feel they'd want to use them. On the other hand, they wanted as many people to use them as possible. So they didn't want to run empty trains or empty cars. So overcrowding quickly becomes an issue. As importantly, well, just to give you an example, by 1872, the 3rd Avenue cars are built for 22 riders, and at rush hour, there were often reported to be more than 60 people in a car. So this is a problem that you associate now with rush hour in the subways, The point is simply to understand this problem hasn't been solved in 150 years, and there were good reasons for it not to be solved. It wasn't always in the interests of the people running this to put more cars on that would be running at different times and be empty. So they were, and it cost a lot of money to be investing in more and more cars. So they were doing a balancing act of what it meant in their mind to run a profitable industry that would return a profit to them. After all, otherwise, why not build a baseball team or do something else? So they had to feel that it was worth their while to invest in this kind of enterprise rather than a department store or a baseball team or something else that they wanted to do. The character of the crowd that we now would associate also complicated. There were class and ethnic differences that begin to emerge, and they're all thrown into these cars together and next to one another, and it didn't make the wealthy people who were initially using these cars terribly happy to see the rest of you crowded next to them. Gentlemen refused to give their seats to working class women, though they would to wealthy women. So all kinds of class prejudices would be exposed, and people would complain about that. Working class men would get on with muddy boots and bring their tools into the cars, and that was going to upset a lot of people. There were often rather people of different social classes being told that for 30 minutes you're going to cohabitate in close, intimate spaces with people you don't very much like in other circumstances, or might not like in other circumstances. It created a kind of social intimacy that created a lot of tensions. Those tensions were encouraged by the fact that that intimacy created opportunities for new forms of enterprise. One was called picking pockets. Think of it as a business enterprise. It was for somebody, but it was often at the cost of someone whose pocket was picked. There were often peddlers coming on to sell their wares. There were beggars coming on. You've seen all this enterprise on your subways today. Okay? They're not so different. They all have their origins to this period as opportunity in cities in which there were a lot of poor people. And remember, there were people who were walking the streets, if you can recall from the 5 Points video, where the young children would explain that it was their task often to go out and find rags or to find bits and pieces of wood that could be used as firewood, either by their family or sold. So these forms of marginal enterprise were means of subsistence for family economies. One thing a family could do to get by is you bring in boarders. A family could decide to bring in other families to cohabitate and live with you as a way of saving rent. Well, the other alternatives to that were sweatshops, use the home also as a workplace, have your children also work for you, and then these more marginal forms. Send them out to work the streets, to find these other forms of subsistence. And these crowded conditions provided opportunities for this kind of marginal labor. The Civil War, however, interrupts much of this labor because one of the things it does is draft not people but also horses. And it accelerates the search for finding some alternative to the horses because there's a limit to how much the horses can pull and they're leaving too much behind. Okay? So there's now an incentive for a new technology. How can we create a technology that can allow us to put some of these carts in a line, in a row, and find something that can pull all of them? We have the steam technology, of course, as you know. They simply have to find a way of improving it. The first effort from this comes right after the war. It comes in 1867. There's an Elevated Rapid Transit Act passed, which would authorize the building of elevated railroads. But while those are being planned, a couple of innovative people suggest an alternative. The man's name was Alfred Beach, as in sun and beach and seashore, and he's the editor and publisher of Scientific American. And he had a new plan. It was to move people as if they were in a pneumatic tube. Some of you may have seen such things if you went to department stores even today, or have seen some images of these in department stores where messages would be sent through a pneumatic tube from one part of the store to another part of the store, or bills would be sent. His idea was to create a pneumatic tube and put people in it and have air push people from one station to another. He actually does it. In 1869 and 70, he has incorporated the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company and creates the first of these mass transit pneumatic tubes. It's known as the Broadway blowpipe. Its principle was to use pneumatic pressure to blow people from one station to another. Basically, to take a huge rotary fan and put it at the bottom of Devlin's department store at Murray Street, have people get into the car, and then the fan would be turned on and it would blow them to the next stop. I know it sounds crazy, but it worked. And the technology, much to my surprise and personal delight, evidence of it still exists. Anecdote, sidebar. I was helping my daughter look at a co-op in Tribeca across from City Hall Park. And we went in the building and they wanted to show us around, and they said, oh, we have banks on the first floor, but all the tenants have room on the basement where they can have storage space, and there's a sub-basement. So I went with Rebecca, we went down to the basement, we go down to the sub-basement, and it's a long series of corridors, and suddenly I see in front of me all the technology and apparatus from the blowpipe. And it's still in the bottom of this building on Broadway between Murray Street and Warren Street, in the bottom of this building. The people in the building have no idea what it's all about. It's just there, but it's been preserved. I need one of these days to go back and take a picture of this stuff, but one could still see it. This was a mule car from 1870, not just horses, just to give you a sense, but I want to get steam locomotive. There we are, the pneumatic tube station from 1870. So that's what it looked like, and you can see the well-heeled people from Scientific. This is again from Scientific American. That was Beach's publication. The idea was they were going to go into through the department store. These well-heeled people walk into that car and be blown down this tunnel, down Broadway. Indeed, 4,000 riders paid 25 cents for the experience and did it. And it was an enormous public relations success. But there were technical difficulties, not the least of which is that it created enormous structural damage above on the ground. And so the department stores and the apartment houses were not happy. And so it was closed down. They did not develop the technology. But that was the earliest effort we have of it. The landlords forced it to close, and the plan dies. And instead, they went back to to focus on elevated cars. But that was the first effort at what we might call a subway, an underground form of transit.
This isn't the City Hall. Like if you go down to the City Hall.
City Hall station, yes.
This is the one.
The R and you could take the R and the W and get off at City Hall, walk across the street, go into the building, ask to go to the basement. That's where it is. Okay, that's exactly where it is. You could find it. Now, you should know that there were other possibilities besides elevated cars. The main one was the cable car, and other cities use cable cars. New York, on the whole, doesn't do that. It was seen as too expensive and that it would interfere too much with street traffic. So New York City never takes routes. It's used on 3rd Avenue, and the West Side L used elements of the kind of cable car system, but on the whole, it doesn't take root in New York City. It takes place in San Francisco. Instead, New York ends up with elevated cars, starting with these were the steam locomotives, and we end up with the West Side. This was the cable, from the West Side cable that was used. You can see the cable up on top. You also can see how disruptive this was. First, you had to have this ironwork. This was before steel. This is all ironwork, so it would eventually rust. That's why you now have a West Side highway that's no longer elevated. There was one that was elevated until the 70s. It was all torn down because it rusted. Steel doesn't have quite that problem. But you can see the cars are on top, and you can see even where you still have the elevated ironwork on some of the elevated trains if you go up north of 125th Street on the one train. I think it's elevated, and you would see some of that. And you would know that underneath it, it means as a car driver, you're really negotiating among all that kind of stuff. And cart drivers would have as well.
Why didn't it work again?
Well, it did work. It worked perfectly fine. They weren't prepared to, and New York basically didn't experiment with them very widely because they didn't want to get involved in all that technology. They thought it was just too disruptive. Instead, they focus on elevated trains that don't require cables to be pulled. They have their own self-motivation. That's the point, okay? You don't need a cable to continue to run along the whole route. 1871, a state legislature authorizes the building of the New York Elevated Railway Company on elevated tracks. And the elevated tracks meant it could speed travel. You don't have to stop at every street corner while pedestrians are crossing or while there's crosstown traffic or anything else. The city contributed $5 million to private investors. And we have the beginning of what is often called today public-private partnerships. What they mean in practice is the city, public services, giving money to private services to run it, and private services that are run by wealthy individuals. So basically, the public-private partnership was usually state legislators, who were mostly lawyers and wealthy people, passing legislation to give state money back to their own pockets as private investors so that they could run these operations. Public-private is a bit of a charade. It's really a way of saying we're going to take public monies and give them to private people to use. That doesn't mean they don't do a good job or a bad job. That remains to be seen. But that's what effectively meant in this case. Okay. The L's begin to emerge. By 1877, there are 5 million passengers on these L's, as they're called in Chicago, and they were called here in New York City. They were soon on 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, 6th Avenue, and 9th Avenue. Some of them today are even incorporated into the subway system, above ground, like, as I've mentioned, the number 1 train. But they are noisy, dirty. They disrupt traffic as well because of the infrastructure that's at street level. And they begin to promote search for yet another alternative. So that's the 3rd Avenue. This is the elevated train on the Bowery as late as 1896. And you can see how it basically takes over a lot of street traffic, creates its own forms of interference. It allows still cars to run down the center in some of the old rail lines. But you can also see that they create their own form of pollution. So they were not always desirable. If you were moving into an area, as for instance in Chelsea, where wealthy people had moved, when the steam railroads go up on 10th Avenue, it in fact encouraged these wealthy people to move out and converts areas like Chelsea back into a kind of working class neighborhood at the end of the 19th century because of that. So that these rails do create neighborhoods. They increase traffic. They are shaped by urban settlement, but they also reshape urban settlement. And they reshape it in part in class lines. Because sometimes it's the most desirable form of commerce, of transportation, and sometimes they're not so desirable. People did not want to live right next to one of these. It would be, think of it a little bit like having your house along the New York State Thruway. You generally want to be a few blocks away, okay? But you want to be close enough so that you can get there quickly, but you don't want to be living right on it. So it's the same kind of pattern that begins to emerge. So the alternative is developed. The alternative is to try to take all those trains and put them someplace else. And where better than maybe underground entirely? And we have the emergence of something that would be called, in other cities, an underground. We use a different term for it. It is a way that is below ground or a subway. The origins, of course, of this underground are elsewhere. London in particular has the subway in place from the 1860s. 1863, you have the Metropolitan Circle line, those of you who have been to London, and that's the circle line that goes around the inner city area of London. Okay? If you buy a ticket within that area, you still pay a lower fare than going outside that area. That line was put in place with the simplest of technologies, which was to not dig very deep. It was what would be called cut and cover. You simply go to the ground level and you dig a trench, put the train in, cover it over. Okay? Not go down very deep, and in some places you will leave, there's air that can go above it. So some of you, if you're on, let's see, the rail line coming out of 34th Street and going north of the city up to Westchester or upstate New York, you'll notice from 34th Street to 96th Street, the train goes underground. But from the first parts of it, you can often see light coming up above. It is a cut and cover tunnel from 34th Street. Or if you're going from 34th Street out to New Jersey on a train, you'll see again that from 34th Street and really 8th Avenue, where the subway is, where the train station is, you have exposure above ground through much of that area. It is basically a cut and cover system for those rail lines there. And that's what this early technology would be. In 1891, New York City decides it's got to try to create its own subway. It has a Rapid Transit Act passed to build transit facilities. The objective again now is to use public money, but to operate them privately. But it introduces a whole debate in the country and in New York City over whether, in the use of public money, the public should have some guarantees. It raises what was called popularly in New York and elsewhere the transit question. Should there be something called municipal transit? A term that emerges in the 90s as a term of debate. And what does it mean to call it public transportation? Should the public have some role in the service of the public, especially if public monies were to be used? And that's a debate. And it's a debate that is not just in New York City. It occurs in every major city with different answers. Companies were demanding money. Vast capital was needed. And the companies, in order to do this, are demanding that they have a monopoly on their service so that they can be profitable. And the cities have to decide, are we going to do that? And if we give the monopoly, should we have some share of that operation? Cities began to argue, should there be a debate about the character of service? Should there be a debate about what are fares affordable? You all are hearing all of that today when you talk about the subways in New York City. Okay? So those debates all emerge then. And it emerges around a city reform movement that forms in support of something it calls municipal socialism. It is some of the reformers, we'll talk about them next week, but they're arguing for public ownership of transit. Arguing that transit needs to be seen not as an enterprise, but as a public service. Less as simply an enterprise, but as a public service. So that becomes a huge debate. San Francisco decides in favor of, in many of the cities, municipal public transit systems. New York City decides differently and establishes a privately run system. And that makes New York different. San Francisco, Milwaukee elect socialist mayors, and they establish municipal public utilities, public water, public electricity, public transportation, public sanitation, fire and police as public services, schools or hospitals, all are part of a debate. And we have this debate organized around something that's called the Public Ownership League in these cities. But as I've tried to suggest, New York, basically, those groups lose around rails. They win around other things, and we'll be talking about that. But they lose around the rails. We do have a public school system that emerges, for instance. Most of the companies are, in fact, in New York, actually happy to have the state play a role. They're not in favor of having the state take over the system, but they would like to have the state to play a role because they see the state as providing monies that they can use. And they see the state as being able to gain them the right of way that they need to build their subways. It's something that will be called eminent domain. It's something that Columbia University is struggling with today in trying to basically claim all the area in the north of their campus in the western part of what would be called Harlem. And they're claiming it as part of eminent domain, arguing that while they're a private university, they provide a public service. And the courts recently ruled in favor of, I think, one man who owns a huge warehouse there and says, this is my private property, and they shouldn't be given eminent domain. But eminent domain has been used by cities in the public, in arguing when there is a public interest, they can take land from private owners. The city can determine what is the fair market value and give them fair market value for that. That was done in building the aqueduct, the water system to New York City. Eminent domain was put in place to get land from private owners in order to let the aqueduct run a straight route. Okay? So there were precedents for this issue of eminent domain, and in building the subway to this day, they need eminent domain in running through areas where there are houses underground, basements, and other areas that have to be moved. The state, only the state has the right to eminent domain. So these private companies are dependent on the state to exercise and rule in their behalf. So it's tricky. They have to find a way to be able to legitimize the notion that eminent domain, serving the public, should be given to a company which is privately owned. So the private companies want to support the state, but they want to remain publicly owned. They have to negotiate this kind of tricky verbal terrain. The companies are given 20-year leases from the city as a consequence, not permanent ownership. 20-year leases from the city. The lowest bid would win a contract. The city would finance the tunnels and the tracks with municipal bonds, for which taxpayers, meaning those of us who have an income, would pay the interest on the municipal bonds to allow these public service, privately run, to be developed. The municipal bonds would then be usually to wealthy and mid-income people who could afford them, and the interest would be paid by all the taxpayers. So they would basically float these bonds, and some wealthy people would buy these bonds, and the rest of us would pay for them. The city would exercise eminent domain, and a company would get a 20-year lease. And for that lease, the company would equip and operate the lines, and at its own risk. The company was, quote, taking the risk. The city and the company would also provide a 20-year renewal if it was mutually agreed. After 20 years, in other words, the city could buy back the operating rights at fair market value. If it waited 40 years, the city could just take them over. The tricky part about all that is it provides different kinds of incentives to the private company if it knows that after 40 years, its value is simply going to be taken from them. It gives them very little incentive to turn any profits back into the construction, into the maintenance of the equipment. If you're going to lose it after 40 years, you might as well strip it bare before you give it up. Okay? So this was not always the wisest social policy, as you can imagine. It had implications. Nonetheless, proceeded. I should note one other thing. These companies were going to pay rent for this of 1% a year of interest on the bonds. So there was to be some payback, but very nominal, minimal. In 1900, the Rapid Transit Subway Construction Company wins the lowest bid. It's accepted. It's at $4 million, and it breaks ground in March of 1900. it opens what is known as the IRT, the Interborough Rapid Transit. 4 years later, on October 27th at 1904, and it opens across the street from the Pneumatic Tube, City Hall. Okay, a kind of symbolic gesture to the politicians. The line follows Broadway to Beekman Street, to Lafayette, and then back up Broadway to 14th Street. Then up Park Avenue. It is basically the 4, 5, and 6 train as far as you go to 42nd Street, if you're wondering what it is. The old IRT lines, they were known when I was a young lad, which is a few days ago, they were known as the IRT. We simply called the trains the IRT, the BMT, and the IND. We didn't have color codes and have numbers, and there's still people of even an older generation that refer to taking the IRT train. So that's the 4, 5, and 6, and the 1, 2, and 3 trains. In fact, they would take it. The original line goes up to 14th Street, and then up Park Avenue to 42nd Street, then goes across to Times Square in what is now the shuttle, but it was one train, and then up Broadway to 96th Street. It's the number 1 line. Where it splits, a west branch goes up Broadway into the Bronx. That's the number 1. And an east branch goes to Lenox Avenue north to 141st Street, crosses the Harlem River. It's the numbers 2 and then the 3 line. They divide as well. So those are your earliest lines. See what we can find from all of this. I think I even have a pointer. Whether it works is another matter. So much for pointer today, the battery. I think you can pretty much see this is Lower Manhattan, right? We're going up here north, Broadway. This is Central Park West. The line these are the earliest of the lines. These are all the IRT lines, the rapid transit system, okay, as they began to emerge. The construction required 12 subcontractors working on 17 different sections. It was elevated above 125th Street. It could work with the elevated lines that were there. And it was more than 100 feet below ground in sections. It was not just a cut and cover line. In 1902, it authorized an addition that would take it south of City Hall into Brooklyn, as far as Flatland Atlantic Avenue via Bowling Green. Okay. That's, again, the number 1 line. The cost, $35 million. Some of it was cut and cover, but much of it involved blast tunneling, underwater pressurized tunneling. It was dark. It was dangerous work. The labor was difficult, and it did provoke strikes. There was a strike shortly after they opened in April of 1900, and it won for the workers higher wages of 75 cents a day for water boys and up to $4 a day if you were a foreman. So if you were a foreman, you might even be able to afford using the transit as it was opening. The conditions were not dramatically improved from some of the earlier conditions, but there were more of them. There were 500 cars ordered initially. Each was 50 feet long and 9 feet wide, made of wood with doors at the end. You can go to the Transit Museum today and still see some of these early cars. Many predicted that New Yorkers would, quote, never go down below ground like moles. But New Yorkers were happy to be moles anytime, and we went down in droves. Indeed, in the first year, 5 million passengers used this new system. They were not 5 million passengers, were not 5 million different people, needless to say. Some customers brought picnics and marveled at the new technology and all the furnishings. They were the 8th wonder of the world when it opens. The IRT public relations, I quote, "The ceilings are separated into panels by wide ornamental moldings and rosettes. Above the wall bases is glass tile. Ceramic mosaics are used for decoration and name tablets." Indeed, artistic emblems adorned a lot of the stations, and much of that has been reconstructed. And if you go, for instance, to Astor Place, you'll see the ornamental ironwork outside of one of the early stations that still exists. So there was wonderful ornamental, playful ironwork that invited people into these stations, and inside the stations there were mosaics and tile work. They were used as decorative spaces, as an aesthetic experience for people going underground. However aesthetic they were, political problems soon arose. Some property owners didn't cede their right of way to eminent domain so quickly, and the New York State legislature had to intervene to insist that the city had the right to exercise eminent domain. So there are early political battles to win eminent domain for the construction, and that is done, and the city is willing to strong-arm some private owners on behalf of these private owners, so you have a kind of conflict there. Secondly, there's public pressure. These lines only serve some people, but everybody argues we deserve a new subway. So there's very quickly political pressure to increase the number of lines. Everyone begins to want them. But the IRT, it is not in their interest to have any competition. So the IRT argues very early that we agreed to do this with the understanding that we would have a monopoly, that we would not have competition that would undermine our profits. So the IRT, which has won this bid, now leads the fight to prohibit the development of any additional lines serving anybody else. That's to say they would serve the public, but only the publics as they were prepared to serve them. In 1910, the governor feels he has to intervene, and he replaces the Board of Rapid Transit Commissioners with something he calls a Public Service Commission. The problem, he argues, is that the Board of Rapid Transit Commissioners are, frankly, public officials deeply in bed, not like journalists embedded, though probably not unlike in the process, in bed with these private developers, and are not being willing to argue that their monopoly should be broken in the public interest. So he replaces them with what he believes is a public interest organization, and that's, again, this Public Service Commission, a state board, not a city board, with the authority to grant franchises under state regulation. So in 1910, we begin to get these companies now having to operate, if they're going to be there, under state regulation, and it involves, in this case, the New York State as an entity exercising authority over the city, which it's arguing the city is not operating in the public interest because private interests only are being prejudiced in his service. In 1911, the Public Service Commission then opens talk with competition, a Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, to build an elevated railroad line that would, in fact, offer additional services. From the perspective of the IRT, it's called competition. From the perspective of the Public Service Commission, it was additional service. They had developed a compromise. The city announces the emergence of a dual system subway in which the IRT and this new Brooklyn Rapid Transit, which will later be the BMT, would share expansion and operation by agreeing basically to divide the turf so as to not compete directly. And the city system bears witness to that to this day in the shape of the new subway system. The Brooklyn Rapid Transit System agrees to spend $75 million of its own money, but $123 million of the city's money. Now, mind you, its own money was money that it was getting from banks where you were depositing your money, so don't worry too much about their spending their own money. That's also a complicated configuration, but it has to repay that money, so it does have obligations to that money. It doesn't have to repay the money it gets directly from the city. So it's indirectly getting some public monies, but it's taking the risk on repaying those monies. It's not taking the risk on the 123 million that it gets directly from us. However, in agreeing to do so, it agrees that it will build in Manhattan and Brooklyn a Center Street loop. Williamsburg Bridge to City Hall to Brooklyn Bridge, basically a place where the trains could all turn around in lower Manhattan. The IRT would build the long-delayed Lexington Avenue line to serve from 42nd Street north. So the IRT, which had only gone as far as 42nd Street on the 4, 5, and 6, now agrees it's going to build the 4, 5, and 6 and serve the east side, which had not been served. In agreement, the Brooklyn Transit Company agrees that it will not go north of 59th Street in Manhattan. And it would build instead in Bronx and Queens. It would not build in Bronx and Queens. Instead, it would build in Brooklyn. Okay? It would be the B and the D trains. The IRT agrees it would not go south of Flatbush Avenue, or it would not go into southern Queens. The Brooklyn system basically agrees that it will develop the rest of Brooklyn. It gets some additional lines also into some of Queens, obviously. These lines, Brooklyn and Queens, are fairly adjacent. And some of these lines, in fact, will extend into Brooklyn, including the Brooklyn L train. This dual system has, again, more success in terms of ridership, economic development in new areas, and it's a spur to labor and suburban development. But there are problems within the system itself. I don't know where that's the IRT station of 28th Street in terms of design elements. Okay, do I just push pause?
Continue.
Continue. Voila, the new lines into Queens. The problems within the system that persist. The Center Street Loop opens in 1913 and uses turnstiles. New problem. People use slugs. People begin to cheat the subway system. They have a new problem of corruption in the subway system. Crime increases dramatically in the teens. Because of the enclosed spaces, it replicates the kind of crime patterns we had seen earlier in the horse carts. Pickpockets increased. There are 34 pickpockets arrested in a 10-month period in 1913, and there are regular reports of strong-arm ruffians working the subway systems. And finally, you know what these cars must be like in the middle of summer. In winter, they were fine. You were underground and protected from the elements. But in summer, they were hot as Hades. There was no air circulation and little help at best with any of the fans. Certainly no air conditioning. There was also labor exploitation reported. The tunnel being built in 1915 collapsed, killing 7 and injuring 130. There was a 1916 strike by motormen that spread to subways for higher wages. And the strike reduced service for a couple of weeks and is lost. But what it does do is it stimulates union recognition among people working in the subways. And this will be a very important legacy going into the 30s for the development of unionization of the subways, which involves some major strikes in the 20th century, as some of you will know, and we'll pick up that story also in the next weeks. That's to say, we have the beginning of public service industry unionization in the subways because of the harsh conditions in the subways in the teens. So the stimulus to public service unionization comes out of the harsh conditions of the subways and their rapid mobilization. Finally, the city and its public complain about poor service. The city invested $241 million additionally in 7 routes in 1920, compared to only 30 miles of routes. I'm sorry, there were 70-mile routes in 1920. There are There had only been 30 in 1910, and the city is constantly investing more of its money to encourage this. But the companies are complaining of profit squeezes and asking for additional state subsidies and arguing that unless they get more money from the city, public service will be curtailed. They want reduced taxes. They ask for fare increases. The fare was 5 cents, by the way, but they want a transfer now of 2 cents to be paid. It stays 5 cents for the first half of the 20th century. It's a little more today, I'm told. In 1918, the lines report that they were losing $6 million a year. The city refuses to help them. It claims that, in fact, their numbers are being jerry-rigged. The city claims that these lines can be run profitably for 5 cents and threatens to seize the companies, as was their right after 20 years, if the company doesn't live up to their constraints. Indeed, in 1921, the employees accept a 10% wage cut when the companies threatened to go into receivership. What do we know? We know that the companies complained of losing money, and we know that workers took wage cuts. We also know from the New York Transit Commission report that, quote, revenue that should have gone into better facilities or into maintenance services was put into the private pockets of owners and wealthy shareholders through swollen dividends. That's to say, we need to understand that they were reporting losses, but they were losses after they were taking profits. To give an example, the companies paid dividends on deferred rents. The Brooklyn system, between 1914 and 1918, paid $36 million of dividends on $74 million of capital. So basically, half the money it was making, it was putting back in its own pockets rather than reinvesting in the system or using for wages. The IRT paid $65 million or roughly 12% a year in interest to its shareholders. There were no deficits to shareholders, there were only deficits to workers and to city riders. The result is that by the 20s and the 30s, the trainmen organized in New York City under a militant Irish labor leader, Michael Quill. If you go to the Tenement Library today in Bopst on the 10th floor, which is the labor library, they have a conference room. It's called the Quill Room, and you'll learn about the history of transit and Michael Quill in New York. I'll talk about him in 2 weeks. He's now buried in Ireland. He was a Republican, nationalist, and communist-informed labor leader who was given support by his working men in the industry in good part because they were hearing from the Transit Commission of fiscal hypocrisy and of self-interest by the transit leaders. The state, the public sector responded. The state builds its own lines, an independent line, or the IND, the A, the C, the E, and the F. And the city takes over the subways when the contracts expire in the 1950s. In the public takeover, however, it takes over problems as well as assets. The public gets blamed for the dilapidated state of the equipment and the roadbeds that had been deprived of any proper maintenance by private owners that had pocketed the profits. It needs major infusions of capital to rebuild after years of neglect from its owners. Secondly, the wealthy, who were the source of tax revenues and who controlled the New York State legislature from their various suburban bases, have no interest in actually using mass transit in New York City. And increasingly in the 50s are no longer in fact living in the city, but are working in the city and are in fact moving to the suburbs. So the very people who are there in the 1950s at the time that the city needs infusions of money to its mass transit, the people who have access to that capital are increasingly living in the suburbs. That's to say the tax base for the city is being eviscerated. And finally, a third problem that the city inherits has its origins at the same time at the development of the subway. 1911, it's called the Model T, the automobile. The cheap auto and the rise of the suburbs after World War II with the interstate highway system represent massive state and federal subsidies for private transit, but not for public transit. At the same time as the city is needing revenues. We have a love affair, we have a love affair with the auto as a tool of personal choice, free of schedules, free of crowding, free of contact with poor people, often of color. And it meant increasingly from the 50s forward, the smart money does not invest in mass transit. It invests in highways, gas stations, oil companies. Mass transit instead is left in the hands of cities to serve increasingly those who can't afford who can't afford cars on the one hand, can't afford to park their cars, even if they could afford the cars, and are dependent on the mass transit. Despite all of that, it's worth noting that New York City develops the biggest, and in terms of service and cost and range, arguably the best transit system in the world, and has that today. London has 275 stations that serve over 253 miles. To give you a point of comparison, New York City has 734 rail and subway stations with over 700 miles of subway. It is almost 3 times the size of London, which is number 2. Cities number 3 and 4 are Paris and Tokyo, and they are lines of only 150 miles. Moscow is number 5, and it carries 9 million passengers a day compared to over 8 million that the MTA was carrying, including in its buses and subways. So other cities were able to do more, but no system has tried to cover as large an area and service as many miles of track and of stations and lines as New York City. It is the model of a mass transit system for the world. The crime of New York City subways was the fiscal legacy that required 2 generations from the 50s into the 90s to finally overcome and leave us with the greatest system of the world, albeit one that we pay a heavy price for using. Okay, see you next time.